Our text is going to be Mark chapter 5, verses 1 through 20. Mark 5, 1 through 20. So if you want to turn in your Bibles, we'll go ahead and read that through together. We did send out the outline and discussion questions via email yesterday, but we do have paper copies up there on the bistro tables if you want them. I'm a little bit challenged this morning because some of the core people that make a lot of these things happen, like posting stuff on the website and emailing and making slides happen, they've stepped out. So you'll notice there's flowers in my slides today. It's because I didn't know how to get them out. You can thank Stephanie for she's always the one that I count on for stuff like that, but she's away, and you just don't necessarily appreciate all these things these people do for you behind the scenes till you don't have them for a week. So I'll be glad when she comes back, and I'll tell her never to leave again. No, all jokes aside, our text is Mark chapter 5, verses 1 through 20. Follow along with me as I read. They came together to the other side of the sea, into the country of the Gerasenes. When he got out of the boat, immediately a man from the tombs with an unclean spirit met him, and he had his dwelling among the tombs, and no one was able to bind him anymore, even with a chain, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains, and the chains had been torn apart by him, and the shackles broken in pieces, and no one was strong enough to subdue him. Constantly, night and day, he was screaming among the tombs and in the mountains, and gashing himself with stones. Seeing Jesus from a distance, he ran up and bowed down before him, and shouted with a loud voice, he said, "What business do we have with each other, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I implore you by God, do not torment me." For he had been saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And he was asking him, "What is your name?" And he said to him, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he began to implore him earnestly not to send him out of the country. Now there was a large herd of swine feeding nearby on the mountain. The demons implored him, saying, "Send us into the swine, so that we may enter them." Jesus gave them permission, and coming down, the unclean spirits entered the swine. And the herd rushed down the steep bank into the sea, about 2,000 of them, and they were drowned into the sea. Their herdsmen ran away and reported it in the city and in the country. And the people came to see what it was that had happened. They came to Jesus and observed the man who had been demon-possessed, sitting down, clothed in his right mind, the very man who had the legion, and they became frightened. Those who had seen it described to them how it had happened to the demon-possessed man, and all about the swine. And they began to implore him to leave their region. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed was imploring him that he might accompany him. And he did not let him, but he said to him, "Go home to your people and report to them what great things the Lord has done for you, and how he had mercy on you." And he went away and began to proclaim in Decapolis what great things Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed. Now, last week, in the end of chapter 4, we saw Jesus and his disciples leave the crowds in Galilee and set out across the sea, and they encountered a storm along the way. And this week, we're basically picking up right where we left off last time. They're arriving now on the other side of the sea in the country of the Gerasenes. Now, the country of the Gerasenes was in a region known as Decapolis. We see that in verse 20. They mentioned Decapolis as well. It's on the eastern side of the Jordan River. Let's see if this has yeah, it does have a pointer, but basically Jesus started out in Capernaum in chapter 4. He was still there, and he sailed across the sea, and he's basically landing in this area. Do you see where Decapolis is there? He's landing somewhere in this area. The text calls it the Gerasenes here, but depending upon if your version, it might say Gergesenes or Gadarenes or something of that nature. But the idea there is that he landed on this eastern side of the Sea of Galilee and on the eastern side of the Jordan River there. And unlike Judah and Galilee, this region of Palestine was inhabited primarily by Gentiles. The worship of the Lord and Jewish culture was pretty much non-existent in this area. So when Jesus and his disciples got out of the boat, it was as though they were stepping into a whole different world, even though in reality they'd only traveled a few miles from Capernaum Arguably 6-8 miles is all they really traveled. But even though they're that close, they've basically stepped into a whole different world. And honestly, what came to mind as I read through this text over and over again, what came to mind was the upside down in the show Stranger Things, confession time. I've watched Stranger Things. Have you guys ever seen Stranger Things? Most of you haven't, so I'm at a disadvantage, okay? Follow your own convictions on it. I say it's a pretty good show. Really interesting show. And the idea there is in Stranger Things is there's this place called the Upside Down, and it's basically a parallel universe that exists in the same area as normal reality, but everything is weird there. Everything is strange there. The scenery is the same. There's trees, there's roads, there's buildings, etc. But at the same time, it's all weird. It's all different. Everything is dark. Everything is toxic. Everything is hostile there. And believe it or not, our text that we just read this morning is a lot like this. We have the same general area. There is the sea, there is the arid land, there is the people, there is the towns, but at the same time, it's strange. Spiritually speaking, this region is darker, it's more hostile, and there's nothing about it that's behaving normally. Things are quite different. And it's as though Jesus stepped into a parallel universe when he got out of the boat and landed here. Now, we'll spend a lot more time developing the darkness of this place and how it was strange in a few minutes. But first, let's clarify why this was the case at all. And to state it simply, this place was spiritually dark, and this place was strange because there was no light shining there. And I know it's an oversimplification, but it's true. The light of God's Word was not influencing the environment there. It wasn't shining there as it was in Judea and in Galilee. Thus, the environment in the place where Jesus landed was acclimated for spiritual darkness. It was accustomed to being in the dark. And with this in mind, when Jesus stepped off the boat and onto the shore in Decapolis, it was like he flipped on the light switch in a very dark room. Boom, just like that. And everything in that area started reacting to the light that was just being shined in. And, think of it this way. When you're asleep in your bedroom with the lights out and someone comes in and flips on the light switch and says, "Wake up," how does that feel for you? Does anyone like that? Anyone at all? There's a few. Okay, I have a couple people nodding their heads saying yes. In my house, no one likes that. I'm okay with it. I can deal with it. I don't know if it was from the old Army days where I kind of got used to it or something, because that's the way they woke you up in the Army. But I know when if I try that with Holly, let's just say things aren't going to go well for me. If I try it with my daughters, it doesn't go well either. They just don't like it. They react aggressively. They're shocked by it. They pull the covers up over their head. They say, "Turn it off, turn it off, turn it off." That's exactly what's happening in our text here. Jesus was flipping the light switch on and saying, "It's time to wake up." And the whole environment was basically reacting here. They were saying, "Turn it off, turn it off." It was that kind of a thing that's going on here spiritually. Now, as Christians, we're called to do the same thing. Did you realize that? We're called to be like drill sergeants flipping the light on where things are dark. And that's why Jesus said, "You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Your light must shine before people in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven." As Christians, we're called to shine the light of Jesus wherever we see darkness remaining in this world. And when we do this, we shouldn't be surprised to see the darkness reacting to it and reacting negatively. It's part of the process. It's unavoidable. This account helps prepare us for that. It explains what a spiritually dark environment is like, and it explains how it responds to the light, and therefore it helps equip us for our mission. And with all that said, the more we look at this account, the more it will feel like we've just stepped into a parallel universe. It's going to look really strange. It's going to contrast with everything that we've seen in Mark's gospel up to this point. But in the process of working through this account together, we should start to understand our common mission field and our common mission better. Now, there are 4 things about this account which are really weird. Straight up, they're strange. It's weird. 4 things. And that's what we're going to be looking at now. The first strange thing is the presence of the swine, okay? The first really weird thing about this text that's just totally different than anything we've seen so far is the presence of these swine. You didn't see pigs anywhere in Judah or Galilee where Jesus had been ministering up to this point. If you think back, in Mark up to this point, they weren't there. If you think of in the other Gospels and comparable texts, you don't see them there either. There's no pigs there. If they did exist at all, they were few and far between, and they were hidden, suppressed somewhere, because pigs were no good in Jewish culture. They were unclean animals according to God's law. And for a number of reasons, which I'm not going to develop here, pigs, more than any other animal, had come to epitomize godlessness and evil to the Jews at the time that this was written. They were absolutely loathed by Jewish culture. Now, outside of this account, and its parallels in the other Gospels, pigs were only spoken of in the context of sin and wretchedness. They were never spoken of in a way that's even remotely positive. Would you believe me if I told you that? It never spoken of in a positive way. Let me give you some examples here. This is the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus said, "Do not give what is holy to dogs, and do not throw your pearls before swine, or they will trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces." Not really a positive picture of swine here. And in the parable of the prodigal son, Jesus described the son who squandered his father's estate in a far country in this way. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, and he sent him into his fields to feed swine. And he would have gladly filled his stomach with the pods that the swine were eating, and no one was giving anything to him. Again, this son was so low. He was in a faraway country, away from God's people, and he was so low that he was feeding pigs. That was as wretched as it gets, and they were eating better than him. It was giving a picture of just how wretched this man was. And lastly, Peter said this about false prophets who lead God's people astray. He says, "It happened to them, according to the true proverb, a dog returns to its own vomit, and a sow, after washing, returns to wallowing in the mire." Again, not a pretty picture of pigs here. Among God's people at that time, pigs stood for everything that was sinful and evil, and the presence of pigs were not tolerated in Jewish culture at all. If pigs did exist in Judah and Galilee, they were few, they were far between, and they were hidden. They were not something that you saw at all. Yet, when Jesus steps off of the boat in our text, there's pigs everywhere. Do you notice that? When he steps off this boat, there's thousands of them. There's pigs everywhere, huge herds of them, and herdsmen managing them. It's easy to underestimate the significance of this because pigs are pretty much a non-issue today. How many of you like pig? I like pork roast. It's one of my favorite. It's not an issue for us today. So it's easy to underestimate this. But to give an idea of just how shocking and how bizarre and how weird this would be, if you can just imagine leaving Wheatfield and driving into another town, and there are basically brothels on every corner, and there's prostitution taking place all around, and it's completely legal and accepted by everyone, and no one sees a problem with it. If you can just imagine that kind of a situation where it's just on the street corners everywhere, and everyone's totally fine with it, that's the idea of what you're getting of a change here from Judah and Galilee to the Decapolis. It's that shocking. It's that different. And that's a good equivalent to what's happening here. Swine appeared to be an integral part of their economy. The swine were embraced. They were out in the open. Their presence was totally accepted as normal, and no one saw a problem with them, not at all. In fact, as we'll see later, they even placed a very high value on them. And this is really strange in contrast with what we've been seeing in Mark's gospel up to this point. And this is what I mean when I say that Jesus stepped off the boat into a parallel universe where everything is really weird and everything's really strange. In light of this, what fascinates me is Jesus' response to these swine, or should I say his lack of response to these swine. As we read through this account, did anyone get the impression that Jesus was shocked or appalled by the presence of these pigs? Do you get the sense that he's appalled and shocked and horrified by them? Not really. Honestly, he doesn't even bring them up. They don't really even, they're kind of secondary. He's not really concerned about them at all. Now, what does this mean? Does this mean that he approved of the sin of those people? No, it doesn't mean that at all. It simply means that Jesus understood that the place that he was in was still in darkness. They had no light there. And thus, he wasn't surprised to see people who live without light doing dark things. Does that make sense? It wasn't shocking to him. It isn't shocking for people who don't have the truth, who don't have light, to do things contrary to God's will. Didn't shock him at all. So his response wasn't to be shocked It wasn't to be appalled. He didn't start preaching against the swine. His response simply was to flip the light switch on. He understood that once truth was covering this land, the swine thing would sort itself out on its own, just as it did in any other place. And in the same way today, we are called as God's ambassadors to shine the light of God's truth in dark places. And in the process, we're going to see people living in darkness and doing dark things. And I'm sharing this to say that this shouldn't shock us. We shouldn't be surprised to see sinful people doing sinful things. It shouldn't shock us at all. Responding in shock, responding in horror, attempting to purge sin, these things aren't going to help. It's only going to make things worse. The way to heal the darkness, ultimately, is to flip the lights on, to shine the light. Introduce them to Jesus. Take people who are sinful, introduce them into a relationship with Jesus, and as they walk with him, he's going to sort those things out in his time and in his way. Do you follow me? Okay. So that's the first thing that's weird, it's the pigs. The second thing that's strange about this account is the resilience of the enemy. The resilience of the enemy. Up to this point, Jesus had encountered demon-possessed people before. We've seen it a couple times in Mark's gospel already. However, up to this point, casting out demons was pretty much a cut and dry thing. There didn't appear to be too much of a struggle to it. The normal pattern of demon possession and deliverance up to this point went something like this. Demons would cry out in fear, and they'd say, "We know who you are, and what do you have to do with us? Have you come to destroy us?" They would cry out against Jesus. And Jesus would command the demons to be silent and to depart. And the demon would come out of the person. Sometimes the person would convulse a bit. It wouldn't necessarily be smooth and clean, but they would come out. And then that was the end of it. Plain and simple, pretty much just like that. But this isn't how it went down in this text. This account was very strange in comparison to everything that came before it. Jesus did prevail here, there's no question about that at all, but it wasn't a knockout in round one at this time. It was a little different this time. The struggle was more protracted. Half of the verses in this passage are devoted to the back and forth between Jesus and this demon-possessed man. And quite simply, what we're seeing here is the enemy is more resilient in this case. The enemy is more resilient. The enemy was more aggressive. We see that in the very beginning of the text in verses 2 and 6, where the demon-possessed man basically ran to meet Jesus on the shore as he was getting out of the boat. As he was literally placing his feet on the ground, the demon-possessed man saw him and was running at him already. And the enemy was more resistant. We see in verses 8 and 9 that Jesus was commanding. Notice the way that it phrases it. He was commanding the demon to depart. And he was resisting that. It wasn't happening instantaneously. And he was asking the demon his name. And he wasn't necessarily getting the answer right away. But eventually he did get the answer, and the answer was Legion, which indicated how strong this demon was in comparison to what Jesus had dealt with previously. And also, the enemy was more, for lack of a better term, persuasive. He basically haggled with Jesus over where he would depart to, and he succeeded in getting permission to enter the swineherd. Now, the reason that Jesus granted permission for these demons to enter the herd of swine isn't 100% clear. Most feel that the demons were trying to trick Jesus into being cast into the abyss, and Jesus actually outfoxed them and at their own game and tricked them in the long run, because the result here was that both the unclean animals and the unclean spirits all were destroyed at the same time. There's no question that Jesus prevailed here, but we're not 100% sure why he granted that permission. We're not questioning it, but we're not sure why. But whatever the case may be, the enemy Jesus faced here was far stronger and far more resilient than anything he had faced in Judah and Galilee up to this point. Now, it's not that Jesus' victory was ever in doubt. There's no question about that. But again, the struggle was much more protracted here, and there was some real collateral damage to the area after the battle was over. There was an entire swineherd, thousands of swine that were lost in the process. So again, you have a battle here, but you're lobbing grenades in, and you have collateral damage at the end of it. This was not a smooth thing. It was big. It cost the area. Now, this stronger level of spiritual resistance is what we can expect today when we shine God's light in dark places. Darkness gives the enemy opportunity to dig in, and for this reason, he's not going to come out easily when we shine the light in these places. He's going to be dug in there. He's not going to give his ground easily. And when we're moving in the right direction, when we're shining our lights in the right places, there's going to be all kinds of fur flying. It's going to be ugly. We shouldn't be surprised by that. And with this in mind, we shouldn't fear the enemy. We shouldn't fear him, but we shouldn't underestimate the enemy either. Do you follow me? Shouldn't fear him, but we shouldn't underestimate him either. And this is why Peter says, be of sober spirit, be on the alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. People can become so obsessed with demons and spiritual warfare that they become paranoid. I've seen this before. It isn't good. That isn't the way to go. But it's also a mistake to underestimate the presence of the enemy as well. He is there. We are called to watch out for him and be aware of his adversarial work. If we're doing God's work, we will encounter fierce resistance from the enemy because we are facing him where he is dug in and where he is entrenched. So we will need to be mentally prepared for this so that we're not caught off guard when this adversity comes. Again, the fur is going to fly. It's going to cost people things. People aren't going to like us when we're doing the right thing, and we need to be mentally prepared for all this negative stuff that's going to be happening when we shine God's light in dark places. Now, the third thing that is quite strange about this account is the response of the population. This also is really weird when you look at it. Up to this point in Mark's gospel, when Jesus delivers the demon-possessed, the response is amazement by the population and bigger crowds of people. The first thing they do is they're amazed by it, and they call their friends, and Jesus has bigger crowds than he did before. We see this very thing happening back in Mark chapter 1. I'm going to give you the verse now. Throwing him into convulsions, the unclean spirit cried out with a loud voice and came out of him. They were all, look at it, amazed, so that they debated among themselves, saying, what is this? A new teaching with authority? He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him. Immediately, the news about him spread everywhere into all of the surrounding districts of Galilee. So they were amazed. They spread the word. Bigger crowds are on their way. With this in mind, keep this in mind, look at the response of the population in our account, the one that we're studying today. In contrast to what we just read there, look at the way these people responded when they witnessed this incredible miracle of deliverance by Jesus. Follow along with me. This is verses 14 through 17. Follow along in the text. Their herdsmen ran away and reported it in the city and in the country. And the people came to see what it was that had happened. They came to Jesus and observed the man who had been demon-possessed, sitting down, clothed and in his right mind, the very man who had had the legion. And they became, what? Frightened. Those who had seen it described it to them and how it had happened to the demon-possessed man and all about the swine. And they began to implore him to leave their region. In Judah and Galilee, when Jesus cast out demons, the people were amazed, and they followed Jesus closer. But when Jesus cast out demons here, the people were terrified, and they said, please leave. Isn't that weird? You ever read that and go, that's weird. That's strange. What's going on here? Why is this the case? What's different? Again, it's the darkness. Quite simple. They're affected by the darkness, and so they're reacting to light in a different way. Now, there are two effects of living in darkness that we can see in play here, okay? There's two. First, people who live in darkness fear what they don't understand. They fear what they don't understand. Now, an illustration that comes to mind here, I don't have an image to put up on the board, maybe some of you have heard of it. There's an island out in the Indian Ocean, kind of off the coast of India, called North Sentinel Island. Has anyone ever heard of that island before? It's unique in that it's pretty much untouched by humanity for as long as we have historical records. They estimate that for some 60,000 years, no one has ever really come in contact with the people that are on this island. This island made the news a couple of years back because there was a well-meaning person a Christian who wanted to go and evangelize these peoples, and even though it's illegal, the Indian government makes it illegal to go there. Those people are to be quarantined and left alone. He went anyway and defied it, and when he sailed onto the shore, the Sentinelese found him and killed him right away. He died. And again, you have this idea of a people that are completely isolated from society. They don't understand what's going on around them. They're not exposed to any light whatsoever, and so they're hostile to everything that they don't understand. Back in '05, I think it was, is when the tsunami went through, and there was so much damage in those regions. One of the things that the Indian government did was they flew over the island, and they hovered close to look in and see how they were doing. They weren't sure how the tsunami affected them. And they did find out that they were on higher ground, they survived. And what did the people do? Because they were hovering over top, looking in, ready to drop aid if they needed it. Guess what those people did? They took their bow and arrows and spears and started shooting them at the helicopters. Again, hostile, afraid of what they didn't understand. Even though they were trying to help, they were afraid of what they didn't understand. This is what all people do who live in darkness. This is what it means to live in darkness. This is the way the brain works when you live in darkness. And this is why we can expect a cold reception initially when we shine God's light in a dark place. But the key to delivering people from darkness is to be patient with them and understand this about them and give them the room to be able to make the change. But also to show them in our own life what it means to live in the light, how to live differently. And so with this in mind, how do you respond when things are new and different in your life? When things change, how do you respond? Is it a positive experience for you? Or when things happen in your own life that you don't understand, do you respond with hostility? Do you respond like those people who were in the darkness? There is a way to respond with an open mind, as one who has access to the truth of God's word and nothing to fear. And that's what people need to see in us. As we shine the light, that's how they learn to come out of it as well. We can't bring the light to other people without living in the light ourselves. And that requires us to not fear what we don't understand. Okay, the second thing is that people who live in darkness value possessions more than people. People who live in darkness value possessions more than people. And we see this plain as day happening in this text. The people witnessing this miracle, again, I just read the text to you. There's people gathered around. They're coming to see what's going on in response to all the word traveling about. And so now they see this guy clothed in his right mind. They see the swineherd. So they're facing two realities. One was that there was this uncontrolled demoniac that no one knew what to do with up to this point, and he was totally healed. And the other reality was that this deliverance of this demoniac cost them the entire herd of swine. Both things were true. First, there was this uncontrollable demoniac that they couldn't deal with. Now he's healed. Secondly, it cost them the whole herd of swine. And in the balances, these people were not satisfied with the transaction. They were more troubled over the stuff that they lost than the person that they gained. Do you see that there? There was this incredible deliverance, and all I could think about was the fact that they lost all these pigs. And this is how people who live in the darkness think. They don't place value on human life as God does. And in fact, the more we look at this account, the more barbaric it appears. If you look back in the earlier verses of the account, we see that before the demoniac ended up in the tombs among the dead, the population attempted to chain him up and to lock him away. And you look at it and you think about it, you're like, oh, it's barbaric. And what we're seeing here is that they just didn't appreciate the basic sanctity of all human life that applies to all people as image bearers of God. They just didn't understand that. As we bring God's light to dark places, we can expect this lack of priority in people. They're not going to understand this yet. And in order to make a difference, we must personally show them how to value all human life as God does. We have to live it out personally. We have to show them that. And so I ask you, do you value people above possessions? Do you pursue justice for people, even when it threatens the standing institutions of the day, and when it threatens your security? Do you feed and care for people, even when it costs you economically? These are the things we need to keep in mind. If we don't value people above possessions, then we're living in darkness in some way. The darkness is still affecting us. One of the signs that we're in the light is people are first. People are what are most treasured. Now, the last thing about this passage that's really strange is the command of the Lord. Even the instructions of Jesus here seem really strange when you look at it. They're not, but they seem weird, okay? And here's what I mean. Normally, Jesus calls people to leave everything and follow him. You can probably all think of examples in the text where Jesus says, leave everything. Leave your country, leave your kindred, leave everything and follow me. But that's not what he does here. He does something different. Instead, here we have the demoniac, and he's begging Jesus to let him come along. And Jesus says, no, stay and return to your family. Isn't that strange? Everywhere else, leave your country, leave your kindred, follow me. Here you have the opposite. He's saying, please let me come with you. Please let me come with you. He's saying, nope. Go back home. Go back to where you came from. Go back to your family. Strange. And this guy here, there was no love lost on the place that he was. He didn't want to go back. He wasn't treated well. He had no fond memories or no ties to these people. They had all abandoned him. So for him, it's a different situation. He wanted to come, and Jesus told him to go back. We'll talk about that more in a second, but first let's look at the second one. Also, normally when Jesus does a miracle like this, normally he says, keep quiet. Shh, don't tell anybody. You ever notice that? He does these miracles, he says, don't tell anybody about it. Shh, be quiet. But that's not what he does here. Here, Jesus tells the demoniac to go and tell everyone, far and wide. Tell everybody what happened. Proclaim it far and wide. Again, isn't this strange? Weird. Unusual. Not what Jesus normally does. What's going on here? The simple answer is this. Jesus is applying different tactics to a different situation. Things are different where it's dark. We've seen that. And with that in mind, shining the light will require us to adjust the way that we do things. Have you ever heard that old phrase, this is always the way we've done it? It's always the way we've done it. Doesn't work when you're shining the light in dark places. We tend to have to be on our toes and adjust to the situation that's at hand. And that's just what Jesus is doing here. The demoniac had no love for this place. He wasn't tied to this place. He didn't want to stay there. It wasn't a sacrifice for him to come and to follow Jesus. He was glad to. It was a sacrifice to get him to stay and to proclaim the light where he was. And so the instructions for him needed to be different. And the same thing is true with spreading the news. In Judah, whenever you spread the news, there would be this whole big herd of people, and there was this whole move to have a nationalistic Messiah brought forth. None of that was true in the Decapolis. There, the word needed to be spread so that people could learn about the light. It was just a different environment and a different situation, and so he gave different instructions there. And so it was a strange place. And Jesus was basically asked to leave it. And he was a gentleman about it. He didn't force himself. He didn't say, he didn't force himself on these people and say, I'm not leaving, you can't make me. He simply left. But he also did something else. He left a light behind. He flipped the light switch on. The people got up and flipped it back off again. But he turned on a flashlight. And it kept shining. And that was the demoniac himself. He stayed where Jesus told him. And in verse 20 it says he was very faithful to go and to proclaim everything that Jesus did and the mercy that God had upon him. And if you look in the text there, it says that the people were amazed. Eventually the light started to have effect. People did start to come around as things brightened up and the light began to flicker. And that's what happens as we shine light in dark places today. It's strange in those areas, but it becomes normal as we shine the light in them. And so my prayer is that we will be able to be beacons of light for God's truth. We do that by living it out ourselves, but we also do it by having the courage to push the spotlight in those strange places and deal with it, because it's weird, it's strange, it's uncomfortable. So would you pray with me? Father, we thank you for this example. It's really helpful, because I think it is a temptation for people to try to want to put everything in a category and insist that everything work the same way for everybody, every person, every culture, every land. But we recognize that the gospel is prevailing in some places and it's not in others. And those places where the gospel is not are going to be very different. And I pray that you would give us the wisdom and the insight to be able to minister in those dark places, and the courage to be able to go in there and inconvenience ourselves and to endure whatever comes our way, to be able to see the gospel prevail there. We ask these things in Jesus' name, and all of God's people said, amen.